Okay. Well, good morning. When I hear those kind of introductions, actually, Pat put it in your face, I really feel old. I've got to the stage now where I tell lies about the age of my grandchildren, So I suppose what I've got at least is lots of experience to draw on. The other thing to say, in case it's not obvious, in this room I am the least knowledgeable person about education and schools in South Australia. I've had the privilege, and it has been a privilege over the last few days, to visit 3 schools, but really you're the experts in all of that, and I'm not telling you what to do. What I want to do is to reflect on lots of experience in different places, tell you stories really, and I hope that my stories and my reflections on the stories will make you think about your own school. That's my aim, is to challenge you to think around this issue. I'm calling it inclusion and equity. I'll explain the origins of that formulation in a moment. But what I hope to do is, as I say, is to get you to think about what you do and what else you might do. Okay, as Pat says, obviously I've done lots of my work is in the UK, but because of my involvement with UNESCO, which is the main United Nations organisation concerned with education, I've had the good luck to go and work with and learn from schools in different parts of the world. So it's those experiences that I'm going to draw on during this presentation. So I'll set the context in terms of global thinking about this theme. In 1990, there was a major world conference called by the United Nations organizations to launch what they called Education for All. And I quite like that phrase, Education for All, because it speaks to people who need to be relevant to all of this, not least, families and people in the community. And terms like inclusion and equity, if we're not very careful, create a kind of fog because they're jargon that are not usually explained. So the idea was that the United Nations organizations, they brought together leaders from all over the world, quite a lot of prime ministers, presidents, and they launched this theme of education for all. And the reason that became a priority was because at that time, there were literally millions of children around the world who didn't receive any education, didn't go to a school, didn't meet a teacher, because where they live, there are no schools and teachers. Now, here we are, all these years later, and the latest estimate, which was announced about a month ago, is that currently 270 million children, approximately, around the world, 270 million children around the world do not receive education. I mean, it's an unbelievable figure. You think about all the efforts that's been put in and the pressure that's been put on governments, but that is the staggering situation that we're in. And that is useful when you reference that in relation to your situation in your state, but also in your local area. These children were part of the 270 million children. This picture was taken a few years ago in the city of Mumbai in India. And it's a story which I think has some important implications for what we're talking about here today. These children live on what we would call a shanty town, an estate towards the centre of the city, made up of homemade houses and where people share facilities and services and so on. And there was no school where these children lived. What happened was a committee was formed of parents, or to be more accurate, mothers, and that might be significant. A committee of mothers was formed, and they, whilst not knowing about the theme of education for all, instinctively, they wanted education for all their children. They had the help and advice of a local charity. They collected some money, not very much. They got some materials, and they built a classroom. And the thing you can see in the back of the picture is the classroom that they built. Now, it certainly doesn't look like a classroom in my country, and I'm sure it doesn't in the part of the world where you live, but this was their classroom. Standing in front of the classroom, literally on the first day of their schooling, were the young children who were going to school for the first time. And of course, like all children all over the world, when they go to school for the first time, some of them are smiling, some of them are not looking somewhat uncertain, and of course some of them look scared to death. What is all this about? Suddenly I'm going to go to school. Standing in the shadows are two women. One of the women is the chairperson of the committee that built the classroom. The other woman is a teacher, because once there was a classroom, the local government provided her teacher. Now, I tell you that story, which is miles from our experiences in many senses. I tell you the story for two reasons. The first is to remind us, you in your country and me in mine, that we are at the luxury end of the global education world. The buildings that we have, the materials and resources we have, the human resources we have, including many highly trained human resources, are beyond the imagination of the majority world. We have to keep reminding ourselves that. And for you as school leaders, that focuses your mind on what is surely the most important thing that you have to do, and that is to make good use of all those resources, particularly the human resources. But the other reason to tell this story is, in a sense, to give you my main point today, in case you get bored with everything I ramble on about. This is my main point. We can make progress with regard to education for all. We can make progress towards a more inclusive and equitable education system if, like these mothers, we have the collective will to make it happen. It's not a technical challenge, although there are technical issues associated with it. It is a social challenge. It's bringing people together and developing that collective will to say, we will make education and quality education available to all children. So that's my key message. Okay. Following on from the 1990 conference, the UN have pressed on with all sorts of strategies and documents to try to put pressure on governments around the world. And a key moment occurred in 2016 with the announcement of 17 Sustainable Development Goals. They're illustrated in that circle there. So 17 sustainable goals to which almost every government of the world committed themselves. Sustainable Development Goal 4 is about education. And in the international debate about these goals, because it's quite a while away now, what has been said very often is that Sustainable Development Goal 4 is the key to all of the goals. That if you want to improve economies, if you want to improve democracies, if you want to improve social conditions, and so on, as the other goals specify, then education is the key. So this is not just about improving literature and numeracy and all those things. Of course, they're important. It's about creating citizens who've learnt to live together and value one another, and that is the power that will influence the development of societies. From the Sustainable Development Goal 4, they developed then a policy, Education 2030, which has tried to push the agenda forward. And of course, we're very rapidly creeping towards 2030, and frankly, progress in general globally is not all that encouraging, but it defined the agenda in a way that I think is useful, certainly for us here in terms of our debate. It says, and I'll read it, inclusion and equity in and through education is the cornerstone of a transformative education agenda, and we therefore commit to addressing all forms of exclusion and marginalisation, disparities and inequalities in access, participation and learning outcomes. So it's giving a clear lead, particularly to governments, which is what the UN is concerned with, that this has to be a transformative agenda, right? And I think that concept is crucial to everything I want to say. It's not about making minor changes or making adjustments on the edge of the education system. What's being suggested is a transformative agenda. And it goes on to say, we therefore, and this was agreed by almost every government in the world, we therefore commit to making the necessary changes in education policies and focusing our efforts on the most disadvantaged, especially those with disabilities, to ensure that no one is left behind. I think the language of this is quite helpful to our thinking. As part of my work with UNESCO in 2017, I worked with a group of international experts at the request of UNESCO to develop a guide. And we called it A Guide for Ensuring Inclusion and Equity in Education. It's available free on the UNESCO website, and there is a handout that's going to be distributed to you that's got all the links for these documents that I'm going to mention if you're interested in them. The group that produced this guide, and it's a kind of framework for reviewing an education system nationally or locally, They developed a series of indicators and challenges to challenge people to think about what they might do. But the group also agreed a motto. And I think it's very helpful. It's certainly very helpful to me when I think about what am I trying to achieve when I'm working people within a particular place. Every learner matters and matters equally. It's very simple, it's very clear. And I want you to think about South Australia. Does every learner matter and matter equally? I suspect not. I would say the same about the UK. But I ask you to think about your school, the policy of your school, the culture of your school. Is it based around the idea that every learner matters and matters equally? So that's the global context for all of that. One other thing I want to say, and I like the title of the conference, I feel at home with it. My version of it, as you see, is inclusion and equity. The argument I want to put forward to you is that inclusion and equity is a pathway to excellence. So in other words, we're not here to talk about another project alongside the school improvement project. This is school improvement. School improvement with attitude, if you like. School improvement based on a set of a set of principles. Every learner matters and matters equally. The OECD, and you know they monitor developments all over the world through their testing system, and there are all sorts of issues about that. They conclude this: the highest performing education systems across OECD countries are those that combine quality with equity. In these education systems, the vast majority of students have the opportunity to attain high-level skills regardless of their own personal and social economic circumstances. So I want to suggest to you what we're here to talk about is not another project. It is core business. It's what you're employed to do based on that kind of thinking. And if you get it right, it will improve the quality of education for all of your students. And that has implications, of course, for state and national policy. Okay, with all that in mind, that international kind of political discourse, I'm going to think aloud, based on my experience, about these two questions, and I invite you to reflect on what I say, to think about your experiences. How can we promote inclusion and equity in our schools? And what does this mean for leadership practices? In other words, what does it mean for your job? I'm going to do that by taking you on a fairly rapid tour of the world, and we're going to visit some schools, and we're going to visit some classrooms, and I'm going to reflect on them in terms of what I think they've taught me as somebody who is still learning how to help schools and systems to move forward. Where we're going will take us to schools that are very different to yours, and I don't want you to be put off with that, because differences can stimulate us to think in new ways. But of course, where we're going and what I'm going to talk to you about could create a degree of turbulence. And you remember when you go on the airline, the pilot says, we're going to go through a period of turbulence, fasten your seatbelts. So as I speak, it might be that you need to fasten your seatbelts, all right? So we go to some strange places and hear about what happens in schools and classrooms. The first place we're going to is China. As part of my work with UNESCO some years ago, we made a partnership with a research institute in Beijing. And it was agreed that we were going to work together. UNESCO would support this institute in supporting inclusive developments, initially in certain parts of China. So I went off for the first time, and I had the most wonderful welcome. Those of you who've been to China have had the same experience as me. It's a very welcoming place. People are very warm, and they want to make you at home and so on. And the people who I met from the institute, they wanted to explain to me how things were going to work. And they told me that I was going to be introduced, as I went around, particularly schools, as a foreign expert. And they gave me a book, a guide for foreign experts in English. And immediately I was feeling quite intimidated, the idea that people are going to introduce me as a foreign expert. They're going to expect me to have something to say. Anyway, as is my wont, as soon as possible, I asked, and it was arranged, that I would visit some schools and to see what was going on, and with the help of interpreters, to hear what was going on. I'm going to show you lots of photographs that I've taken, and you'll realize I'm not a very good photographer, so they're really not to celebrate my photography, but to remind me of the experiences. Immediately when I visited the schools, I faced something that was beyond my experience. typically in the schools that I visited at that time, and it is a few years ago, and Chinese friends tell me things are better, but at that time, typically there were 70 children in the classroom. So there I am, sitting at the back of the class with my interpreter and thinking, 70 children, I'm the foreign expert. How am I going to tell them what they need to do to make their lessons more inclusive? As I watched the lessons, I found some interesting things going on. I noticed, for example, that like me, many of the teachers stood on a platform, many of them quite short, so they could see the children who were quite a long way away at the back of the classroom. But then I also noticed that the teachers were particularly skillful at using questions. And in their discussions with their classes, sometimes they would ask a question and the children would answer chorally, asked together, something I don't think I have ever seen in recent years in the United Kingdom. So children were used to answering chorally. But then, of course, every so often, the teacher would invite individuals to ask the question. And at that point, children would put up their hands. Now, it's here when you start to realise that schools are very similar all over the world, and classrooms are very similar. But then when you look closely, there are subtle differences. Now, I used to work in Romania, in Eastern Europe, and there the children used to do this. In England, they would do this. What would they do in South Australia? What do they do?
Yell at you?
What's it? A finger, maybe? Well, it's the same technique, but it gets kind of adapted to fit with local traditions, I suppose, really. As I watched this process, the teachers would ask individual children to put their hands up to answer the question. But then I noticed sometimes the teacher would ask children who had not put their hands up. And it occurred to me that this was a rather clever technique that the teachers were using to create a sense of inclusiveness in the classroom. Even if you don't put your hand up, you may be asked to answer. So you've got to listen, you've got to be engaged. It did occur to me sometimes that children would put their hands up even though they didn't know the answer, to hide and so on. But what I realized, and it was a kind of change in my thinking here in China, but in some other places about the same time, that there's a lot goes on in schools that you can learn from, and it tends to be local and related to local traditions. So, for example, I talked to some of the teachers about what I'd seen and how they were struggling to make sure all the children were engaged in the lesson. And some of the teachers told me about they had another way of doing this, and that was that between the lessons and at lunchtime, the very successful students were expected to support those who were falling behind. And a lot of kind of military type language was used. We've got to march forward together, for example. I interpreted it as being rather military, I don't know. But the children would help one another to try to keep up. And when I asked about this, they said, well, this is part of our culture, in the family, in the village, in the district, and in the school. It's anticipated that you help one another. Now, I think about my culture in my country, in England. It's a very individualised culture. And when I think about what happens in school, often I think the parents tell the children when they go to school, don't help anybody else. You've got to be the best. You don't be helping somebody else to keep up. So all of this is tied up in local culture. So what they were building on was a tradition there in China. I mean, as an aside to that, I saw something that really surprised me. If you go in McDonald's in Hong Kong, now you might say, why would you go in McDonald's in Hong Kong? Well, they have very nice coffee and they usually have clean toilets. But if you go in McDonald's in Hong Kong, they have little signs around the room. No studying. Now, we don't have that on the signs in Manchester. Because what you're finding out about is that children and young people want to work together doing their homework. They can't do it in their home, many of them, because they live in very small, crowded apartments. So they go to McDonald's, or they go to the library, or they go to the station. So this tradition of children helping and working together is part of the culture that they seem to be building on in China, and I think in other Asian countries. So my first lesson, drawn from all that, and this is very fundamental to everything I'm going to say, is if you want to move your school forward, if you want to strengthen practice, particularly inclusive practice, the starting point is by building on the knowledge and the skills that are there within your school. My conclusion from having worked with lots of schools, including in my own country, pretty well always, schools know more than they use. That is to say, on any day, in your school, I'm arguing, there is more skill, more knowledge, more creativity lying latent than is being used. So the logic of that, therefore, is if you want to improve practice in your school, you've got to move knowledge around. You've got to create a school where it's not just about the children as learners, but also the adults as learners. And my argument is by investing in the learning of adults, that's likely to improve the learning of children. But of course, there are all sorts of difficulties to do with that, not least to do with finding the time. But it's also to do with creating an atmosphere where teachers and other staff are learning together. And of course, that takes you back again to the issue of management and leadership. Okay, so let's leave China. Fasten your seatbelts. We're going on a long journey, and we're going to Africa. We're going to Ghana. Excuse me while I have a quick glass of water. This is a school. Ghana is a small country across the coast on the equator. It's very hot. And this is a village school that I was taken to as part of our work in supporting developments across the country. It's the only school in the village. In one sense, the situation's quite a lot better because, as you can see, there's certainly not 70 children in this class, and that was typical of it. You might notice, for example, that there's one student who's quite a bit taller than the rest. I didn't notice it at the time, and I never found out, but I suspect she was either resitting the grade, which I wouldn't recommend, or possibly she'd been ill or whatever. The building is very simple. The furniture is very simple. I saw some children carrying chairs on their head because the school didn't have enough chairs to sit on, and then they would take them at home in the evening. There's no proper windows, there's just these open areas in the wall. And as a result, people from the village can come and look what's going on. And of course, if there's a visitor, particularly a visitor with white skin, then everybody wants to come and look, find out what the hell is going on down in the school. I talked to some of the teachers about why I was there, and I said, I was part of UNESCO, and UNESCO wanted to help teachers to do a better job and to make their lessons more effective for all the children. And I said, what kind of help do you think would be useful to you? And almost immediately, without thinking, one of the teachers said, if we could just get some books. And he explained that for every lesson, he had one book. And so if he wanted the children to read the book, he had to write it on the blackboard. And the blackboard was pretty simple, I have to say. Or I have to read it. And I thought, what an unfair world it is, isn't it? What did it cost to fly me from the UK to Ghana? How many books could that buy? These are the kind of personal dilemmas that you experience if you do this kind of work. As I spent my time around the school, I spotted this young man. He has a quite severe physical impairment in one of his legs. And I was told his father had made him a stick so he could help him to get in and around the school. When I got a chance, I asked the teacher about this student. And I said to him, how come he comes to your school? And he had no idea what I was talking about. I said, how come he comes to this school? And he said, where else would he go? You see, I was asking the question from the UK or from the West, if you will, A student like this might be placed in a separate provision of some kind, a special school or a special class, certainly in my country. But this is the village school. There's only one school. All the children go to the school. All the teachers live in the school. So where else would he go? The teacher said, sometimes it's a bit of an issue, like when we're doing sport, but the other children help him. And there's a lesson there which I'll come back to. The other children helping him so that he can participate and be part of the lesson. So from that kind of experience, I take another lesson. It's about how we see differences. Are differences a problem to be fixed or taken away? Or, under the right circumstances, are differences a stimulus to innovation and to think about new ways of working? I work in the city of Manchester, the first industrial city, now a post-industrial city, if you will. Very proud of it. I hope you'll come. Of course, it's famous for football around the world. I asked some children in the schools this week, what did they know about Manchester? And of course, they all knew about United and City. So differences can be a stimulus. In Manchester, we have in the schools 150 languages spoken, approximately. We had some research from the university. 150 languages. 60% of Manchester school children are bilingual. We used to see this as a massive problem. And frankly, it can still be a challenge, of course. But as the system has matured, people have used the stimulus of those differences to innovate and to think about how do we make sure that these children and young people are actually part of the school, part of the lesson. So how we see differences, and I'm using the word in the general sense, it can mean many different things, as we heard this morning of the presentation from Queensland. How we see differences, is it a problem, or is it something that can stimulate us? Okay, fasten your seatbelts again. We're going to Europe. We're going to visit a school on the outskirts of the capital city of Austria, Vienna. It's just before Christmas. The snow is thick and the nice blue sky is quite beautiful and picturesque. I'm spending time again with colleagues visiting a school and listening and trying to make sense of what's happening. Here again, the context is so different. There are 17 students in this particular class. Look at the furniture. Compare that with what we saw in Ghana. Look at the materials that the children have got. This is how every child in the world should have this. You know, this is ideal in a sense. The teacher introduces the lesson and says this is going to be a lesson about the new year. And they talked about the new year because it was just coming towards Christmas. And he said, well, we're going to make calendars. And he talked about calendars. And then the students started making calendars that they were going to take home. It was a very nice atmosphere in the classroom, very busy. As I watched and listened, I realized there was one of the students who was sitting on his own at the back of the room. Sitting with him was another adult. And eventually I was able to ask, what's all this about? And I was told that this boy had been categorized, labeled, if you will, as having special educational needs. And because of that, in the policy of Austria, he gets his own teacher, a support teacher. What a brilliant idea, you know, and it's the kind of thing in my country that parents fight for, and we have lots of disputes. But then as I watch what goes on, the support teacher works with the individual student, giving him a different task, or maybe an adapted task, I can't remember. And as she works with him, often she stands between him and the rest of the class. So is this inclusion? Or is this a new subtle form of marginalization, exclusion, whatever language you would work at? You see, the potential of having two adults in a classroom is just fantastic. You know, if they plan together, if they use one another's strengths, if they talk about what they're doing and make adaptations, then you're creating a professional dialogue that can really help all of the adults involved to develop their thinking and practice. But if it's like this, where the extra adult effectively is a barrier to the participation of this student, so he doesn't listen to what else is going on, he doesn't learn from the other children don't learn from him, he's kind of segregated within the classroom. Now, I think this is a worrying trend in many parts of the world, certainly in my own country, and it's something we have to think about. Because moving in an inclusive direction requires that we have to identify and address barriers to participation of learning. And again, we heard mention of that in the presentation about Queensland. Now, The concept of barriers is used a lot now, and it's in Sustainable Development Goal 4. And I think it's an interesting concept, but we need to, again, be cautious with it. What do we mean by barriers? You see, the curriculum can be a barrier if it's not designed with all children in mind. The forms of assessment we use can be a barrier if they don't celebrate the progress of all children, some of whom may be making quite slow progress. Of course, our teaching methods can be a barrier if we don't know how to design a lesson where all the students can have a chance of participating and learning and contributing. So the issue of practice is very important in all of this. But then some of the most difficult barriers, difficult to identify and difficult to address, are the barriers in our minds. The limitations of our own experience and our own imagination. If we don't believe that all the children can be there contributing, then it's quite likely that it won't happen. But be clear, this is fundamental to what I'm asking you to think about. I am not talking about barriers within children. I'm not talking about barriers within families. I'm not denying the differences. What I'm talking about is barriers that we can do something about. Barriers that are there in the context that can be addressed. And in the example from Austria, sadly, tragically, this person who could be helping to break down barriers, unintentionally of course, has started to create barriers for that one particular student. Okay, where are we going next? We're going back to Asia, and we're going to the Socialist Republic of Laos. We're going to a classroom in the capital city of Vientiane. Now, I worked in Laos quite often for a period of time, and at that time the country was quite isolated, and I've not been recently. It was quite difficult to get in there. You had to get a visa in Bangkok and all this kind of stuff. So it was quite isolated. And as usual, I had the opportunity to watch some practice. This particular lesson started with the teacher pinning a picture on the wall that he had drawn of birds, trees, flowers, all the local nature. And for a little while he talked about his picture. After about probably 10 minutes, he said, right, and he wrote a question on the board. I want you to go in your groups and discuss this question. Immediately, the students turned around and started talking. It was clear that they'd done this before. It was a routine. It was clear he'd taught them how to work in groups. The classroom was transformed. These students who had been listening, or maybe not listening, suddenly became active learners. Look at their body language. Look at their faces. One of the boys has got a pencil and he's recording the things that they are agreeing as part of the discussion. Now, this points to something quite important, I think, for the agenda we're here to talk about in relation to practice. If you want to have a school where newcomers, students who have particular difficulties, students maybe who have other languages and so on, if you want to have a school where those students can be included, then you have to have this kind of practice. Not all the time, not every day, not every lesson, but at suitable moments, students have to work in groups. And in that context, the newcomer can be integrated. Children themselves can be the force of integration. Look at their faces, their body language. These kids are really engaged. So a newcomer would be drawn into the social climate of the classroom. So it's clear that this is a strategy that can strengthen inclusion within a school, sometimes called cooperative group work. It's not just go and sit around and talk in groups. It's carefully planned, used at an appropriate moment, children being taught how to work in groups and how to take responsibility. But with lots of research to suggest that this is a very powerful means of creating a more inclusive learning environment for newcomers, somebody who's come from another country, somebody who's come from special provision. Newcomers are more likely to be integrated in this setting than in a setting where the children spend most of the day sitting in rows working on their own. But then there is other research coming from a different angle which comes to a similar conclusion. What we know from a lot of systematic research, a lot of it coming from the United States, is teachers who are skillful at using this kind of cooperative group work simply get better standards. They get better learning. It's a technique for improving standards in your school. So here we've got an interesting collision, a strategy that will make the lesson more inclusive, but a lesson that will become more effective. So it goes back to my point early on. Inclusion and equity as a pathway to excellence. But of course it won't happen by chance. I'm sure this teacher had no idea about the Western research that I've just referred to. He was just a committed, creative teacher who wanted to make his lessons effective for all children. And that's the pattern I find in many places I go to, that teachers want to do that. We have to create the kind of conditions in which that can happen. So for me, the fourth lesson is, this is about making use of human resources. Remember, the collective will to make it happen. An investment in the learning of adults, in the belief that this will improve the learning of children. And it won't happen by chance. It's got to be planned. Time has to be found. Values that create the context where this kind of cooperative working can occur. Okay, we're well on the way on our journey now, you'll be glad to hear. And we're going to India. The first time I went to India, as has been often the case when I've travelled, is I arrived with certain expectations based on goodness knows what, something I'd heard, something I'd read. And I got this impression in my mind that what I would find in India was very formal schools, children sitting in rows, teachers doing much of the talking. And I was taken by my Indian partners to this government school in a very poor area of New Delhi. And I spent the day going around the classrooms. And again, I was staggered by what I saw. The most creative teaching, very, very active teaching going on in different forms. In this particular lesson, for example, the teacher introduced the task, which was to solve a problem in a family. And the children worked in groups again. So the idea of group work is a sort of pervading theme in what I'm talking about, I think. I'm not suggesting that's the only way forward. But they worked in groups, and it was a role play. Each member of the group had a role, mother, father, grandfather, and so forth. And it was very noisy, very active. But I have to say, as far as I could see, very inclusive. All the kids were actively involved in what was going on. After a while, the teacher stopped the lesson, and she asked the children to sit down. And then she asked representatives of each group to explain what they decided, what conclusion they'd come to. Now, here again, this teacher, probably not aware of the kind of formal research from the West, through her commitment to try to make a lesson that would reach everybody, she was using the role play, but she was also using this technique where effectively the children were becoming teachers. The children were teaching each other. Now, again, we know in the West, the research about that, it leads to kind of over-learning when you talk about what you've recently learned. So that was what I saw. And then as I went around, I saw other examples of very active learning going on. At the end of the day, I had a meeting with some of the teachers. And I said to them, I was surprised to find this very active learning. Can you tell me how this had come about? And they explained that a year before, a new school principal had been appointed. Rather respectfully, they called her Madam. And they said Madam had been appointed, and she'd brought some new policies. And one of the policies she'd introduced was that every month, on a Saturday morning, the teachers would come back to the school and take part in workshops. Now, if I suggested that in the UK, it wouldn't be very popular with people. I understand that. But it's the principle that I'm trying to get at, really. And I was fortunate that I was able to take part in one of the Saturday workshops. It was led by Madam. And that's significant, right? The idea of the school principal leading the professional development of the staff, showing a commitment to the idea that professional learning will bring about improved children's learning. Around the school were all these lovely posters that the teachers had developed as a result of their workshops. They were there for the children to see, for parents to see. The two women in the second photograph, the woman in the red sari is Madam, and the other woman is a person from a local research institute who've been helping the school to take this process forward. The teacher said these workshops have really stimulated us to try things out. But they said, we've learned something else as well. When you want to try something out, it's really helpful if you've got another adult with you. And they said, so what we do sometimes is two of us will plan a lesson. We'll be in the room together as each of us teach the lesson, and then we'll talk about what we've learned. Here's another example. It's a pattern now, isn't it? We know from Western research that that kind of professional partnership is probably just about the most powerful form of professional development. Whoops. The Japanese call it lesson study, the idea that you plan a lesson together with your colleagues, you try it out with your colleagues with you, and then as soon as you can afterwards, you sit down and reflect on it, and then say, what will we do next time to improve the lesson? So it's our lesson. It's a shared responsibility. Now again, these teachers didn't know about that. They just, through their commitment, they'd realised that they needed that kind of professional partnership. I said, well, the obvious question, I suppose, how do you find time for that? How do you find time to be in one of those classrooms for this kind of activity? And they said, oh, it's a big problem. And said, but sometimes Madam comes and teaches one of the classes. This is leadership in action, not just talking about it, but actually demonstrating a commitment. Madam comes and takes one of the classes. But they said, it's not the answer, of course, because it's a busy school and, you know, Madam's got lots of responsibilities. So we've tried to find other ways of solving that problem. Other ways of solving the problem. A problem-solving culture, if you will. And they said one of the things we do is sometimes we put two classes together so that the two of us can teach the lesson. I said, I don't understand that. You've got 45 in each class, children in each class. The rooms are very, very kind of full. How can you put two classes together? And they said, oh, well, it's a problem, but what we do sometimes is we take the children outside. And I was able to see a lesson taught by two teachers with about 90 children under the trees. You couldn't do this in Manchester in February, but this was the way that they were dealing with it. And the point I'm making is not take the kids outside. I'm talking about that working together to solve the problem. You know, there isn't time. We have to find the time. I've used this picture quite a lot, and it's only very recently somebody noticed something that I hadn't noticed, and that was about the grouping of the children. I don't know if you notice it. There are girls' groups and boys' groups, and I don't know whether that was the teacher imposing that or whether the children had chosen. I never know, really. But the lesson I take from this school, and obviously it was a wonderful example of how to move a school forward, and a wonderful example of the role of the school principal in leading all that, is that what this is about is creating a different culture in the school, a culture of experimentation, a culture of collaborating and sharing ideas, and through that, developing a language of practice so teachers can talk to each other. You see, I said earlier in this conversation, schools know that more than they use. You have to move knowledge around. Not so easy, of course, apart from finding the time. See, I watch lots of lessons, and when I can, if I can, I sit down with the teacher after the lesson and I say, look, I'm not an inspector. This is not performance management. I'm trying to learn from you about your teaching. And then I go through my notes and I say, I saw you do this, heard the children do that. And I kind of like a mirror on the lesson. Now, when I do that, particularly with experienced teachers, they express surprise. And they say, I don't remember doing that. Did I do that? And of course, what it reminds people like me who live in the twilight zone of the education system is how intensive the day of the teacher is. There is no time to think. There is no time to talk. Lesson after lesson, planning, adjusting your planning on your feet, taking account of the reactions of the children. It's why, of course, teaching is so exhausting. People who've never been teachers can't understand it. Why are teachers so tired? We know why teachers are tired. They're physically tired. They're on their legs and feet all the time, moving about. They're emotionally tired. They've got these people who are draining them all the time. I'm talking about the senior leadership team. But then in a way which we need to respect, they are intellectually tired. Planning on your feet, like jazz musicians. They play the same tune over and over again, but each time they adjust it to the reaction of the children. And mostly you do it on your own. And as a result of that, you find it difficult to explain what you do. You just do it, and you've learned how to do it. Now, I think in schools that make progress in terms of practice, through the sorts of things that we heard about in Delhi, teachers have opportunities to see one another working, and that stimulates the development of a language of practice. And I ask you to think about your own schools. Do teachers in your schools see one another working? Not every day, not every week, but occasionally. My challenge to you is this. From my experience, if teachers don't occasionally see one another working, in order to think about and talk about practice, you're not getting the best out of your workforce. You have to create the kind of atmosphere and the time where actually teachers talk about practice because occasionally they see one another working. I don't mean every day, as I say, but just on an occasional basis. And of course, what that does then, it changed, we've talked about the culture of the school, the way we do things around here. It creates a culture which encourages innovation and experimentation. Okay, the last stop on the journey, you'll be glad to know. And we're going back, of course, to the most wonderful country in the world, the United Kingdom. Right? I have to take you there as well on my journey. Over quite a few years, I've had the good luck, and it was luck really, to work on a series of quite large-scale system change initiatives. Most of them were sponsored by government, and a number of them had quite high budgets, which was quite handy, and is a bit of a flaw in my argument if you haven't got that budget. But I've worked on a whole series of these system change projects in England, in Wales, and in Scotland. And something that's emerged from those projects is something that seems to be potentially quite powerful if you can make it happen. And that is schools learning from each other. I've emphasized the idea of professional learning within the school, and that's fundamental for me. But then I think you can add to that by creating the kind of opportunities where schools learn from each other in partnerships and networks, whatever sort of phraseology you want to use. In some of the projects in the UK, we talked about families of schools, bringing schools together who are dealing with similar kind of populations. The current project I'm working on, and we're just literally going into the 5th year now, is in Scotland. And with my colleagues from the University of Glasgow, we've been supporting an initiative in the city of Dundee. It's the 3rd city of Scotland. It's quite a small city. There are about 60 schools, early years, primary and secondary. And the project is called Every Dundee Learner Matters. Every Dundee Learning Matters. And what it's set out to do is to make the best use of all the energy and expertise that's there in the city of Dundee. I should say that the Dundee as a city is quite small, but it's quite challenging. There are, of course, areas of relative wealth, but there are areas of really extreme poverty. And tragically, Dundee has the reputation as being the place with the highest number of drugs-related deaths in Europe. That's a tragic thing to say. So it's a very challenging environment. But of course, like everywhere I've taken you, there are always good people, creative people who want to make things happen. What we've developed in Dundee, based on those other earlier projects, is a strategy for bringing the city together around a common purpose. And as I say, we're now in the 5th year of that, so it's a tremendous experience as a researcher to be part of this system change environment. We focused on the 3 Ps, as we call them. I found from earlier projects it's quite useful because people are busy and they don't know what's going on. Teachers particularly, they haven't got time to, read reports, or often they've not been at the meeting. And of course, ultimately, all of this is dependent on teachers. As I often say when I speak to policymakers, don't forget, teachers are policymakers. When the teacher goes in the classroom, as far as the children are concerned, he or she is the policy. It doesn't matter what the government says, it doesn't matter what you say. If the teacher understands the policy, it will happen. If he or she doesn't understand or doesn't agree with it, it probably won't happen. So somehow you have to take people with you. Now, I think simple tricks like this, the 3 Ps, it's to try to get across to everybody in Dundee, this is what the agenda is. And I took this photograph in the foyer of a school, and the 3 Ps are presence, so that's about attendance, coming to school on time. It's about participation, so it's about being valued, being welcomed, having your name used so that you're seen as somebody who's being an important part of the school community. But ultimately, it's about progress, as I've stressed through this talk. Inclusion and equity, a pathway to excellence. So what we're trying to do here is to reach out to all the children and young people across the city, but we hope ultimately this will have an impact on standards. Through the way we've set up the strategy, based on various earlier experiences, we've set up what we've called design features. And I was thinking a little bit about that as we were hearing about Queensland this morning. Central to the strategy is the strategy group. Now, this is something I've learned from these big projects. You need a group of people who will take it forward. And in my experience, and certainly it is the case in Dundee, you need school principals as part of that group. Of course, you can have people from the administration. Of course, you can have people like me from the university who's there as a kind of critical friend. But the key people are school principals. So in Dundee, this strategy group meets regularly. And if I can, I attend the meetings. And they are developing the strategy and making sure it happens, coordinating it and monitoring it. Around the diagram are the various features that have been incorporated into it. We'll send you these slides if you're interested in. So for example, every school in Dundee has set up one or more what do they call it? I can't find it. Anyway, it's school inquiry groups. So every school has a school inquiry group. Some have more than one. And they are made up of staff, members of staff, teachers and so on, whose job is to identify the barriers that some children are experiencing and then work together to address those barriers. In addition, every school is part of a partnership, a trio of schools, made up of schools that they don't normally collaborate with. They have their local area clusters, but we orchestrated, the strategy group has orchestrated, groupings of 3s, we call them learning 3s, where schools that don't normally work together are encouraged to challenge and support each other. One of the strategies we used, and it's proved to be very powerful there and in other projects, is what we call peer inquiry. So the idea is that just occasionally, senior people from the 2 partner schools will spend a morning in your school. After an initial briefing, they will go around the rooms, informally watching what's going on. They'll talk to the teachers. Critically, they will talk to the children. There's no doubt the voice of children is a crucial way of stimulating innovation within a school. And again, that was mentioned this morning in the discussion of developments in Queensland. So they're there as co-researchers, really. And what we're talking about is developing schools as centres of inquiry, centres of research. And the partners are there as co-researchers. And at the end of the morning, they sit down together and they reflect on what they've learned and what the implications will be. Now, I've had the privilege occasionally of shadowing some of these peer inquiry visits. I remember on one occasion, in a primary school in a very disadvantaged area, I shadowed the visitors around the school. And at the end of the morning, they met together with the principal of the host school, and they discussed what they saw. Now, all 3 schools serve very disadvantaged communities. And I remember one of the deputy principals said, I noticed something this morning. She said, when I was with the very youngest children, watching what was going on, I noticed that the children only talk if there's an adult with them. If there's no adult there, they don't talk. They just get on with their tasks. And she said, it's only seeing it here I realised that's what happens in my school. So this is the kind of professional learning that's created when you have the chance to see different ways of working. People who are doing similar things to yours, but where there are subtle differences. So I think that in terms of system change, and I've been thinking about this with various colleagues while I've been doing some visits in South Australia, the potential for more networking and partnerships, and perhaps some of you will tell me about examples that you've got here that we can learn from, it is definitely a way forward. So, to sum up, 6 lessons in terms of the development of a school around notions of inclusion and equity and excellence. Building on what's already there, moving knowledge around, valuing differences, seeing differences as a stimulus for innovation, addressing barriers, contextual barriers, as a result of collecting evidence that make you think about the experience of the children, making effective use of available resources, especially the human resources, developing a language of practice and encouraging experimentation and innovation, and of course, schools learning from one another. Just one other visit, very quickly, if I can get it to move. I've had the privilege of working in Portugal over quite a long period. Portugal is probably the most inclusive education system in the world, and it's quite a story. About 25 years ago, the then government, took the decision to close all special provision. They literally closed it all down. Of course, there were a lot of dispute and so forth. All the resources that was in the special provision was relocated into local schools. The specialist teachers, the speech therapists, the educational psychologists, they were in local schools. Critically, local schools in Portugal work in clusters, local area clusters, some bigger and some smaller. So you've got a group of schools who work together, and the expertise is there to support them. There are one or two other features of Portugal which seem to be important to what's happened. School directors, as they call them, are appointed for 4 years, and then if they are seen to be successful, they might be appointed for another 4 years, and then they're finished. The appointment committee that appoints them includes members of families, parents, and so on. So this has created an atmosphere where the schools are part of the community, and the community are very much involved in the school. I was reminded of that the other day when we visited an area school in a quite isolated part of the state. And the sense of the school and the community in that area was very open, and the families clearly were very much tied into what was happening in schools. Now, Portugal has made that a matter of policy in both the urban areas and in the rural areas. I got involved in an evaluation of inclusive education in Portugal for the OECD, and there is a report. There's a handout that's going to come around, and you'll have the links to all these things I've talked about. And one of the things I picked up in Portugal, and I heard the minister say it, and then I heard school directors say it, and I heard teachers say it, and I even saw parents say it, and it was like a mantra. They said, you don't have to label to intervene. So they've tried to reduce, if not eliminate, labeling, categorization of children in the belief that that becomes another barrier. Now, it's very difficult to achieve because, of course, we all use labels in everyday talk. But that's fundamental to what's happened in Portugal. The only other thing to say about Portugal, over that 25 years, as they have moved towards a more inclusive education system, on the international testing of PISA, almost each time Portugal has improved. So it seems that as they've invested in diversity and inclusion and equity, that seems to pay off in terms of the results. What then are the implications of this for leadership practices? And implicit in what I've said, demonstrating a commitment to collaboration. Think of that woman in Delhi. She's actively involved in professional development. Encouraging an inquiring stance. I worked with one school in the Manchester area, and on one occasion I went to the school and the principal said, I want to show you my school development plan. And I kind of sunk in my chair. The idea of a school development plan doesn't exactly excite me. But what she wanted me to see was there was no targets, there was no priorities, there were just questions. And she said, this year our school is going to address these questions. This is going to be the basis of our professional development. It's using differences as a resource, so the way in which the school principal and other senior people deal with differences and use differences is crucial. But it's also dealing with turbulence. if you bring about the sort of significant changes that I've talked about, and of course they take time, it's not an overnight project, then there's going to be turbulence. There's going to be people who say, you know, I don't want to do that, or I'm doing all right anyway, why do I need to change anything, you know? So you're going to get that, but what some researchers have said about that is turbulence is a good sign. If you're not getting a degree of turbulence, it probably means nothing's changing. See, teachers are very clever at agreeing to do something and then closing the door and carrying us on as has not been discussed, you know. So turbulence, in a sense, it can be a good sign. And of course, ultimately, for people who are leading and managing this kind of thing, it's about values. It's about creating a sense of common purpose. Okay, remember the most important factor, the collective will to make it happen. Turn to the person next to you or the people around you. What have you been thinking about? Just think aloud now for a few minutes. What have you been thinking about in light of all those stories from all those different places? Okay, thank you. Thank you. Shh. I sometimes talk to children, if I can, in the school, and ask them, you know, what's it like to be a student here, you know. And sometimes kids will say, well, it's very good and the teacher's very good, but sometimes just when we're getting working, the teacher will stop us, you know, just when we're getting interesting. And of course, what the teacher's doing, as I'm doing, is keeping an eye on the clock. I'm going to be around the next couple of days, and I'd really like a chance to talk to some of you. I don't suppose I'll get a chance to talk to all of you, and I'm very happy to answer questions if I can. But I hope I will get that chance for those conversations. I'll finish with a commercial as well. Thank you very much.